The digital clock on the mahogany bedside table struck 0300 a.m. With an aggressive crimson glow, a malevolent eye blinking in the profound darkness of the master suite, serving as a silent, electronic warning. The silence that draped over Cavendish Manor was not merely the absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating, physical presence. A thick velvet shroud that had been slowly asphyxiating the life out of the estate for the better part of 2 years. It was a cold, impenetrable slab of marble that crushed Julian Cavendish's chest every single night, pressing down with the weight of unsaid words and unshed tears. He did not sleep, he merely existed in a state of suspended animation. Lying rigid beneath the high thread-count gray silk sheets, his eyes fixed on the ornate plasterwork of the high Victorian ceiling. Waiting, he was always waiting, waiting for the dull ache in his soul to lessen, or for the inevitable chaos to shatter the fragile peace, and then, punctual as an ancient family curse, the chaos erupted. A sharp, double, synchronized, and heart-rending scream pierced the soundproof walls of the East Wing, tearing through the stillness of the English countryside night. It was not the typical, fussy crying of 2-year-old toddlers. This was something far more primal. It was the howl of 2 wounded animals, a sound saturated with an anguish so profound that no child should ever have to know it, let alone give voice to it. Jack and Harry, the twins. Once again, Julian Cavendish, the man who moved millions of pounds in the London property market with a single stroke of his fountain pen, squeezed his eyes shut and let out a groan of pure, impotent frustration that died in his throat before it could become a scream of his own. He sat up in bed, violently throwing back the expensive duvet. His bare feet touched the Persian rug, but the chill of the floorboards beneath it seemed to rise up through his soles and settle in his spine. "Not again," he murmured into the gloom, running a hand over his face, feeling the rough grit of a 3-day beard scrape against his palm. "Oh God, please, not again." It was the 5th night in a row, and this was the 3rd nanny this month. The agency in Mayfair had assured him that Valerie, that 23-year-old with impeccable references, but the fragile appearance of someone who hadn't broken a china teacup in her life, could handle the situation. "She has a special gift with difficult cases, Mr. Cavendish," the agency director had told him, with that tight, artificial smile that Julian detested. Lies. It was all bloody lies. Nobody could handle them. Since Eleanor died, the twins had become little tyrants of grief, rejecting any attempt at comfort, smashing antique toys and vocal cords alike. Julian stood up, ignoring the silk dressing gown hanging at the foot of the 4-poster bed. He walked out into the hallway, a long, elegant corridor lined with ancestral portraits and abstract works of art worth more than most people's lifetime earnings, but which now, in the pre-dawn gloom of the manor, seemed like spectral judges watching his failure as a father. The shouting grew louder, echoing off the wainscoting. Julian clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. He was going to sack her. He didn't care about the hour. He would write her a generous check, triple her salary, call a private car, and throw her out onto the wet pavement that very night if necessary. He couldn't stand any more incompetence. He needed silence. He needed order. He needed to stop feeling like his own home was a battlefield where he was perpetually the loser. He walked with heavy, determined steps, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. Mentally, he rehearsed the cold, cutting words he would use, the armor of the unfeeling businessman sliding into place. "Pack your things. You are useless. Get out." Anger was a safe haven for him. It was infinitely easier to be furious than to be devastated. He arrived at the heavy oak door of the nursery. The solid wood vibrated slightly with the force of the twins' lungs. Julian had always expected to find the worst. The nanny sleeping with earplugs in, or worse, yelling back at the children, or perhaps crying in a corner, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of their misery. He had seen it all before. He put his hand on the cold brass doorknob. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the disaster, and pushed the door open forcefully, ready to assert his authority as the master of Cavendish Manor. But what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks, paralyzing him in the doorway. The room was not dark. A warm, golden light emanating from the adjustable side lamps bathed the space in a soft amber glow. And the sound, they were not cries of pain. What Julian had heard from the hallway, distorted by the distance and his own predisposition to pessimism, was not crying. It was laughter. Julian stood motionless, unable to process the surreal scene unfolding before his eyes. It was as if he had stepped through a portal into a parallel dimension where joy still existed. In the center of the room, on the soft, cream-colored wool rug, stood Valerie. She wasn't wearing a shabby nightgown. She was wearing her service uniform, the perfectly ironed navy blue dress, the starched white collar, and the most absurd thing of all, she was wearing bright yellow marigold gloves, the kind used for scrubbing dishes in the scullery, and she was dancing. But it wasn't a normal dance. Valerie had enormous black headphones covering her ears, connected to her own world of music that Julian couldn't hear. She moved with an overflowing, comical, exaggerated energy. She swayed her hips to one side, making funny faces. She used the yellow marigold gloves as if they were puppets, waving them in the air, spinning around with an awkward but intentional grace. And in front of her, in their white wooden cots, Jack and Harry stood, holding onto the bars. They didn't cry. Their eyes were wide open, bright, full of tears that had not yet fallen, but their mouths were open in loud, raucous laughter. They clapped with their chubby little hands, banging on the bars to the visual rhythm of the nanny's frantic movements. Ah, ah! Harry's crystalline laughter could be heard, a sound like breaking glass, but beautiful. A laugh that Julian hadn't heard in months. Valerie, unaware of her employer's presence at the door, continued her performance. She bent down. She pretended to stumble over an invisible log. She stood up with a dramatic turn and pointed at the babies with her rubber-gloved fingers, making an exaggeratedly surprised face that provoked a fresh wave of giggles from the little ones. Julian felt the ground move beneath his feet. That scene defied all logic. It was 3 a.m. He was a serious man, owner of an empire, widower of an elegant and sophisticated woman. And at home in his children's nursery, a domestic worker was putting on a silent comedy show with cleaning gloves. He should be furious. He should be outraged by the lack of decorum. But his eyes turned to his children. He saw the color returning to their pale cheeks. He watched as the night terror dissipated, replaced by pure, unadulterated, childlike joy. For a second, just a single second, Julian's heart of ice cracked. He remembered how happy this house felt before the accident. Valerie executed a final turn, a kind of strange pirouette, and opened her eyes to end her performance, finding herself face to face with the imposing figure of Julian Cavendish, standing in the doorway wearing his gray silk pajamas and wearing an indecipherable expression. She froze. The smile vanished from her face instantly, replaced by pure, distilled panic. She ripped the headphones off her neck. They fell onto her shoulders, and the silence of the room returned suddenly, interrupted only by the small, residual snorts of laughter from the twins, who were now looking at their father with curiosity. "Mr. Cavendish," she whispered, her voice trembling, lowering her gloved hands as if they suddenly burned her skin. Julian took a step into the room. The magic was broken. Reality, cold and harsh, came rushing back in with him. The sound of Julian's footsteps on the polished wood echoed like hammer blows. He walked slowly toward her, his long shadow projected over the cots. The twins, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, stopped laughing. Jack sat on the mattress, sucking his thumb, watching his father with a caution that no child should ever have towards a parent. Julian stopped 1 meter away from Valerie. She was short. She barely reached his shoulder. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy ponytail from dancing, and loose strands stuck to her forehead with sweat. She was breathing heavily, not only from the exertion but from fear. "Can you explain?" Julian began with a low, controlled voice, but one laden with a dangerous edge. "What the hell is going on here?" Valerie swallowed. Her hands, still encased in the ridiculous, garish yellow rubber, clasped themselves together in front of her white apron in a nervous gesture. "The children woke up, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though it wavered like a candle in a draft. "They were shouting. They had a nightmare, the same one as always." "I know they were screaming, Valerie. I heard them from the West Wing. What I don't understand is why, instead of calming them down, putting them to sleep, or giving them their warm milk, I come in here and find a... Julian made a vague and dismissive gesture with his hand toward her. A circus spectacle. Do you think this is a nightclub in Soho? Do you think I pay you to come practice your dance moves at 3 a.m. while I'm trying to get some rest to keep the roof over our heads? The attack was cruel. It was intended to humiliate her, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy of British society. Julian expected her to lower her head, apologize, and promise not to do it again. That's what they all did. They shrank from his power, his money, and his grief. But Valerie did not lower her head. She raised her chin, and although her honey-colored eyes shone with the moisture of intimidation, there was a strange fire in them, a spark of dignity that Julian had not anticipated. "With all due respect, Mr. Cavendish," she said, and her voice gained a little strength, steeling itself against his anger. "I tried the usual things. I tried to lull them to sleep. I tried to give them milk. I tried to read them the story about the rabbit you left on the table. Nothing worked. They screamed as if their skin were being ripped off." Julian frowned, surprised by the reply. "And your solution was to put on some headphones and dance like a lunatic?" "My solution was to break the pattern," she replied quickly, taking a step towards one of the cots to arrange Harry's blanket, who was staring at her. "Fear feeds on silence and darkness, sir. When they wake up like this, they are in a loop of terror. If I get nervous, if I try to force them to sleep, they feel my tension and scream more. They needed a shock. They needed to see something absurd, something alive." Valerie took off her yellow marigold gloves with a wet snap and left them on the changing table. Her hands, now bare, revealed reddened, worked skin with short, clean nails. "Laughter is the only thing that gets rid of fear in the body," she continued, looking Julian straight in the eyes, defying that invisible barrier between the millionaire and the maid. "You saw what happened. They were laughing, they were breathing. For the first time that night, they were not suffering. That's a circus to you, perhaps, but to me, that is peace." Julian remained silent for a moment. The girl's logic was impeccable, and that annoyed him even more. He hated that a stranger, an employee who had only been in the house for 3 days, seemed to understand his children better than he did. He, who bought them the best toys imported from Germany. He, who had hired the best pediatricians in London. He felt threatened, not physically, but emotionally. His authority as a father and as the master of the house was being challenged by a girl in a uniform. His expression hardened. He could not allow such insubordination. If he gave in now, he would lose control, and control was the only thing he had left in life. "That's a very touching theory, Valerie," he said sarcastically, crossing his arms, the Swiss watch on his wrist gleaming in the lamplight. "But in this house, there are rules, and the main rule is order. I don't want any clowning around. I don't want noise at all hours. I want my children to learn discipline and routine, not to think that every time they cry a party is going to start." He took another step closer, invading her personal space, using his height to intimidate her. "I pay you a fortune to be professional. A professional nanny doesn't dance hip-hop in dishwashing gloves. A professional nanny maintains her composure." Valerie pressed her lips together, holding back a response that would surely cost her her job. She looked at the children, who were now beginning to yawn, the adrenaline rush of laughter giving way to a natural, peaceful sleep, something that didn't happen often. "Understood, sir," she said quietly. But it didn't sound like hip-hop. It was the Nutcracker. Julian blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Nothing, sir. It won't happen again." Julian felt a pang of something akin to shame, but he quickly crushed it under the heel of his pride. "Let this be the last time," he declared. "The next time I walk through that door, I want to see my children asleep and you behaving like the staff of a respectable family, not like a street performer in Covent Garden. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Cavendish. Good night." Julian turned away with the stiffness of a general leaving the battlefield. He walked toward the door, feeling Valerie's gaze fixed on his back. Before leaving, he paused, his hand on the doorknob. He wanted to say something more, perhaps soften the blow, because deep down he knew the children had stopped crying thanks to her. But his pride, that immense wall he had built to protect himself from the pain of widowhood, wouldn't allow it. "Turn off that light," he ordered without looking back, "and make sure those gloves go back to the scullery, where they belong." He went out and closed the door with a soft but final click. Once in the hallway, Julian leaned against the cold wall, exhaling the air he had been holding. His hands were trembling slightly. The image of Valerie dancing, life bursting forth in that room, had been etched into his retina. It contrasted violently with the coldness of his own existence. He looked toward the end of the corridor, where an oil portrait of his late wife, Eleanor, hung majestically. Eleanor had been perfect, elegant, and composed. She would never have done something as ridiculous as dancing with rubber gloves. "What am I doing?" Julian wondered, rubbing his temples. Inside the nursery, Valerie waited for the millionaire's footsteps to fade away down the hall. She sighed, letting her shoulders slump. She picked up the yellow marigold gloves tenderly, as if they were a treasure and not cleaning tools. She approached Jack's cot, stroked his soft cheek, and whispered, "Don't worry, little ones. Your dad is grumpy, but he's heartbroken. We'll keep dancing, even if it's in secret." She put her headphones back on, but this time without music, just to muffle the oppressive silence of that golden mansion that felt emptier than ever. She knew this was a war between the father's coldness and the warmth those children desperately needed. And she, Valerie, even though she was just the nanny, wasn't going to give up. Mistrust is a costly parasite, and Julian Cavendish was willing to pay the highest price to feed it. Barely had dawn broken after the 3 a.m. incident when 3 black vans from a high-tech security company parked in the gravel driveway of Cavendish Manor. Men in gray overalls with tools on their belts invaded the house, drilling into corners, running invisible cables, and connecting digital eyes in every corner of the home, especially in the nursery and the playroom. Julian watched the operation from the center of the drawing room with a cup of black coffee in his hand and his jaw tense. He wasn't going to allow the circus to happen again. If Valerie wanted to work there, she would do it under a microscope. "I want real-time access on my phone, on my tablet, and on the main screen in my office in the city," he ordered the chief technician. "High-fidelity audio. If that woman's size, I want to know." 2 hours later, Julian was sitting in his office on the top floor of the Shard, the glass skyscraper piercing the gray London sky. The view was imposing, the whole city at his feet, the Thames winding like a silver serpent through the history of the capital, a testament to his power. But Julian didn't look at the city. His eyes were fixed on the screen of his iPad, which was propped up against a marble paperweight. The high-definition image showed the mansion's playroom. What he saw should have reassured him, but instead, it provoked a strange feeling in his stomach, an acidic mixture of jealousy and fascination that he couldn't identify. Valerie wasn't sitting on the sofa checking her phone while the children played alone, like the previous nannies had done. Valerie was on the floor. She had taken apart the cushions of the Italian-designed sofas, those that cost £6,000 each and that no one was supposed to touch, and she had built a kind of giant fort or cave in the middle of the room. There were old sheets hanging from the floor lamps, creating a makeshift shelter. Julian turned up the volume of the transmission. "Quickly, captains," Valerie's voice filtered through the microphone, hushed and urgent. "The lava from the volcano is flowing down the carpet. We have to take refuge in the magic cave." Jack and Harry, who usually dragged themselves listlessly around the house, scurried clumsily toward the cushion fort, squealing with excitement, their eyes shining. They launched themselves inside the fabric structure along with Valerie. Julian watched as she took 3 simple ham and cheese sandwiches, cut into star shapes, and some bottles of juice out of a basket. None of the organic gourmet food the private chef prepared and the boys always rejected. It was simple food, picnic food. "We're safe here," Valerie whispered, and the camera caught her hugging the 2 boys, one under each arm, kissing their sweaty heads. "No one can hurt us here." The boys ate with a ravenous appetite Julian hadn't seen in months. They laughed with their mouths full. Harry offered Valerie a piece of his sandwich, and she pretended to bite his finger, making him giggle uncontrollably. Julian looked away from the screen, suddenly feeling excluded from his own life. He glanced at his desk. A porcelain plate of filet mignon and asparagus, prepared by the executive catering service, lay chilling undisturbed next to a crystal glass of water. He was surrounded by luxury, silence, and success. They, on the floor eating cheap bread and cheddar, had something he couldn't buy. They had warmth. He slammed his iPad shut, frustrated. That afternoon, Julian left the office 2 hours earlier than usual. He stopped by Hamley's, the exclusive toy store on Regent Street, and bought two remote-controlled electric cars, exact replicas of his own Aston Martin, complete with LED lights and realistic engine sounds. They were impressive, expensive toys, perfect for buying a moment of joy. He arrived home with the giant boxes under his arm, feeling like a conqueror returning with trophies. He entered the drawing room where the cave of cushions had already been dismantled and everything was in order, just as he demanded. Valerie was sitting on the rug reading a book with the children resting on her legs. When their father entered, the atmosphere shifted, the air grew heavy, the children stopped looking at the book and tensed up. "Look who's here," Julian announced in a falsely animated voice that sounded too loud in the silence. "Daddy brought presents." He left the boxes on the floor and tore the paper. He brought out the shiny cars. "Look at this, Jack. Harry, come here. These are better than those old cushions, aren't they?" He started one of the cars. The toy emitted a powerful engine roar, and the lights flashed aggressively. Julian moved the control, and the car shot towards the children, skidding across the parquet floor. Instead of running towards the toys, Jack and Harry backed away in fear. The loud, sudden noise, coupled with the imposing and anxious presence of their father, intimidated them. Harry started to cry and ran straight towards Valerie, hiding his face in her apron. Jack followed a second later, clinging to the nanny's leg as if it were a life preserver in the middle of a shipwreck. Julian stood with the car remote in his hand, watching as his children ran away from him and sought refuge with the maid. The toy car crashed into the wainscoting and stayed there with its wheels spinning uselessly, making an annoying whirring sound. The blood rushed to his head. He felt humiliated in his own drawing room. "What did you tell them?" Julian asked, turning off the remote and looking coldly at Valerie. "What poison are you putting in their heads to make them afraid of me?" Valerie, who was stroking Harry's back to calm him down, looked up. There was no defiance in her gaze this time, just a deep sadness. "I'm not saying anything to them, sir. They are not afraid of you. They are afraid of noise. They're afraid that you'll suddenly show up with material things expecting them to love you instantly, when all they really want is for you to sit on the floor with them." "Don't give me lessons on parenting," Julian snapped, pointing his finger at her. "I am their father. I give them everything. This house, these clothes, these toys." "You give them things, Mr. Cavendish," she interrupted gently, though her voice trembled. "But they don't need things. They need to know who you are. They need you to touch them, not to buy them cars." Julian felt like the words were hitting him like slaps. He wanted to shout at her, fire her, throw her out for daring to judge him. But seeing his children clinging to her, he understood that if he threw her out now, he would be completely alone, and that terror was greater than his pride. Without saying a word, he turned around and left the room, going up the stairs to his office, where the security screens reflected back the image of a happy family to which he didn't know how to belong. If Julian was ice, his mother, Lady Victoria Cavendish, was eternal winter. 3 days later, on a gray and rainy Tuesday, the mansion's intercom rang with aristocratic insistence. The butler announced the arrival of his mother. Julian, who was reviewing some contracts at the dining room table, visibly tensed up. He adjusted his tie knot and ran his hand through his hair, a reflexive gesture of a child seeking approval from a demanding mother. "Valerie," Julian called, his voice tense. "My mother is coming. Make sure the children are spotless. Not a stain, not a hair out of place, and please disappear into the background. My mother is complicated." Valerie nodded and ran upstairs with the children. She knew who Lady Victoria was. She had heard the stories among the service staff, the woman who measured people by the brand of their shoes and their grandparents' surname. 10 minutes later, the double doors opened. Lady Victoria entered like a queen conquering a barbaric territory. She was a 60-year-old woman who looked 40 thanks to subtle and very expensive surgeries. She wore a cream-colored Chanel suit, genuine pearls, and carried a silver-handled cane that she used more for pointing and judging than for walking. "Julian," she said, offering him a cold cheek to kiss, "this house smells of damp. You should fire the maintenance staff." "Hello, Mother. The house is perfect. It's the rain." Excuses. Excellence has no excuses. Victoria cast a critical glance around the lobby. Where are my grandchildren? I hope they haven't turned into uneducated savages since Eleanor is no longer around to keep order. They're coming down, Julian replied, feeling that old oppression in his chest, the feeling of never being enough. At that moment, Valerie appeared at the top of the stairs with the twins. She had dressed them in beige linen suits and white shirts, their hair parted to the side. They looked like little angels from a magazine. Valerie carefully descended, holding one of their hands. Victoria narrowed her eyes, not looking at the children, but at the woman who brought them. "Is that the new one?" Victoria asked in a voice loud enough to be heard, full of a mischievous disdain. "She looks too young and that uniform is too big for her. Where did you get her? From a discount agency?" Julian cleared his throat uncomfortably. "She has good references, Mother. The children have adapted to her." Valerie reached the bottom of the stairs. She gave a small bow, just as she had been taught at the agency, although inside her blood was boiling. "Good afternoon, my lady. I'm Valerie." Victoria didn't even look her in the eyes. She approached the children, inspecting them as if they were livestock on display. She ran a gloved finger along Jack's cheek. "They're pale," she declared, "and thin. What do they feed them?" "They eat very well, ma'am," Valerie ventured to say. "Vegetables, proteins." "I wasn't talking to you," Victoria cut, turning her head sharply towards Valerie. Her eyes were two tar pits. "When I want an opinion about the service, I will ask for it. Until then, you are invisible. Understood?" Valerie pressed her lips together, feeling the heat of humiliation rise up her neck. She looked at Julian, searching for some kind of defense, some intervention. He was the father, the owner of the house, but Julian looked at the floor, fiddling with his watch. He said nothing. The great millionaire, the shark of business, became a small fish in front of his mother. Victoria turned her attention back to the children. Harry, sensing the tension and malevolence emanating from that strange woman who smelled of strong, chemical perfume, became frightened, stepped back, and hugged Valerie's legs, seeking safety. Victoria frowned in disgust. "Let go," the old woman ordered, hitting the ground with her cane. "Boy, come here, don't cling to that woman's skirts. She's an employee, not your family. Those people have germs, vulgar habits. You'll get dirty." Valerie felt her eyes fill with tears, not from sadness, but from a helpless rage. Instinctively, she placed a protective hand on Harry's shoulder. "Ma'am, the boy is scared," Valerie said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please don't yell at him." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria opened her mouth in disbelief as if a chair had spoken. "Julian," Victoria said slowly, her voice chilling, "are you going to let this maid give me orders in your own house, to your mother? You've fallen so low, Eleanor must be turning in her grave, seeing how some nobody is raising her children and disrespecting their grandmother." Julian looked up. He was pale. The mention of Eleanor was a low blow. He glanced at Valerie, saw her violated dignity, saw how she was protecting his son, and then looked at his mother, that unquestionable figure of authority. The ancestral fear prevailed. "Valerie," Julian said hoarsely, "take the children to the playroom." This wasn't a defense. It was an order to retreat, a capitulation. Valerie looked at him with profound disappointment, a look that hurt Julian more than any insult. "Yes, sir," she whispered. She scooped the children up in her arms, one on each hip, displaying surprising strength for her size, and walked quickly toward the hallway, fleeing the toxicity of that room. As she walked away, she heard Victoria's voice behind her, cruel and clear. "You have to fire her, Julian. That girl has airs of superiority. It's dangerous. Look at her. She thinks she's the mother. She's just a gold digger who uses children to get to you. I'm warning you, get rid of her before it's too late." Valerie reached the playroom, closed the door, and slid down against it, sliding to the floor. She hugged the twins, who were looking at her worriedly, touching her face with their little hands. "We're fine, my loves," she told them, forcing a smile as a lone tear ran down her cheek. "The wicked witch cannot enter here. This is our castle." She quickly wiped away her tears. She couldn't afford to fall apart. She knew her time in that house was numbered if that woman had anything to say about it. But as long as she was there, she would be the shield for those children, even if their father was too cowardly to do so. At midnight in Cavendish Manor, The darkness always brought with it an accusing silence. But that night, after Lady Victoria's visit, the air felt unbreathable. Julian couldn't sleep. His mother's words bounced off the walls of his skull like a rubber ball in an empty room. She's a fortune hunter. Fire her. Eleanor would be turning in her grave. Julian poured himself a third glass of whiskey in the dim light of his study. His hand trembled slightly, not from the alcohol, but from cowardice. He hated himself for not having defended the only person who had managed to make his children laugh in 2 years. But the weight of the Cavendish surname, the rigid education, and the shadow of a castrating mother were chains that were difficult to break. Tomorrow, he murmured to himself, staring at the amber liquid. I'll give her the check tomorrow and she can leave. It's best to avoid problems. With that bitter feeling in his throat, he left the study. He needed to walk, to tire his body so that his mind would shut off. He walked under the main staircase, his bare feet sinking into the carpet. The house was dimly lit, illuminated only by the garden security lights that came in through the windows, projecting long, ghostly shadows of the furniture. As he passed through the small morning room adjoining the kitchen, a place the staff sometimes used to rest, he saw a dim light. He stopped. His instinct for control kicked in. Someone had left a light on. It was an oversight. He approached stealthily. Valerie was there. She was not in her servant's room in the basement. She was on the sofa in the morning room, an old piece of furniture that had been discarded from the main drawing room. She was asleep, curled up in a fetal position, still wearing her uniform, although she had taken off her apron. She had the baby monitor on the coffee table, emitting a soft, static hum, and one hand dangling towards the floor. Julian watched her. Asleep, she looked even younger. The lines of tension and defense that kept her awake had disappeared, revealing a deep, almost chronic tiredness. She didn't look like a calculating fortune hunter. She looked like a girl exhausted from a battle that was too big for her. He was going to turn around and leave her there, but something on the ground caught his attention. Just below her dangling hand was a small, cheap, silver plastic photo frame that looked as though it had slipped from her fingers while she slept. It was face down. Curiosity, that treacherous impulse, pushed Julian forward. He told himself he needed to know who he was letting into his house with a stranger. She had a boyfriend, secret children, a criminal record. He bent down carefully so as not to creak his knees. He took the frame. It was lukewarm. He turned it towards the moonlight coming through the window. The glass of whiskey slipped from his other hand. The thick glass of the tumbler hit the carpet, muffling the noise, but the liquid spilled out, staining the fabric. Julian didn't care. He couldn't breathe. He felt as if someone had punched him in the solar plexus, knocking all the air out of his lungs. The photo wasn't of a boyfriend. It wasn't of a son. It was an old photo with the colors slightly faded by the sun, taken on a theater stage. It showed two people embracing, smiling with that pure happiness that only exists in moments of triumph. One was a thin teenager of about 17 years old, wearing a black rehearsal tutu and with her hair pulled back in a perfect bun. It was Valerie, but a different Valerie. Her eyes shone with hope. Her posture was elegant, haughty. She held a bouquet of red roses against her chest. The other person, the one who hugged her shoulders with maternal pride, the one who looked at the camera with that luminous smile that Julian had tried to forget so as not to die of pain, was Eleanor, his wife. Julian dropped to his knees on the carpet wet with whiskey. He brought the photo close to his eyes in despair, searching for a mistake, a trick of the light. But there was no mistake. It was Eleanor. She was wearing the sapphire necklace that he had given her on their 5th anniversary. He remembered that day. It was the end-of-year gala of the Cavendish Foundation for the Arts, the charity that Eleanor had run with such passion. "My God," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. He turned the frame. Behind it, trapped between the cardboard and the plastic, was a small piece of paper folded and yellowed with age. Julian pulled it out with trembling fingers. He recognized the handwriting immediately, that elegant, curved script that used to leave him notes on the bathroom mirror. It said, "To my little butterfly Valerie, never let anyone clip your wings. You have the gift. You will dance at the Royal Ballet School, I promise you. With love, your mentor and friend, Eleanor." The date was written in the bottom corner. October 15th, 21. Julian closed his eyes and the memory hit him like a tsunami. October 15th, 2 weeks before the accident, 2 weeks before Eleanor's car went off the road in the rain. He vaguely remembered that Eleanor always talked about a student. "Julian, you have to see her," she told him during dinner, her eyes shining. "I have a girl at the foundation. She comes from a terrible estate in East London, but when she dances, Julian, when she dances, the world stops. I'm going to arrange her a full scholarship to the Royal Ballet School. It's going to be my great legacy." Julian never paid attention. He was busy buying buildings, closing deals, making money. He nodded and said, "That's great, darling," without really listening. That student was Valerie. And then reality crashed down on him with the weight of a court ruling. When Eleanor died, Julian sank into depression. He shut everything down. He closed the foundation, cut off the funding, fired the staff. "I don't want to know anything that reminds me of her," he had instructed his solicitors. By closing the foundation, he had canceled the scholarships. He looked at the woman asleep on the sofa, at the maid with rubber gloves. He had clipped her wings. He had destroyed her future in ballet. The girl who should have been dancing on the best stages in Europe was now cleaning up his children's vomit and enduring his mother's insults, all for a minimum wage in the house of the man who had unknowingly ruined her life. And yet, here she was, caring for the children of the woman who loved her, dancing for them at 3 a.m. to chase away their nightmares. Julian felt a violent nausea. The shame was so intense it burned. He wasn't just a bad boss. He was the villain in that girl's story. Valerie shifted on the sofa, letting out a small sigh. Julian froze. He couldn't face her now. Not with this truth burning his hands. With extreme care, he placed the photo back on the floor, exactly where he had found it, and retreated into the shadows, carrying with him a guilt that weighed more than all his money. Dawn arrived with a cold, gray light, but Julian hadn't moved from his chair in the study. He had spent the last 4 hours reviewing old files on his computer, digital folders he hadn't opened in years. There it was. Everything. Valerie Munoz's file, now anglicized in his mind to just Valerie, daughter of an unknown father, sick mother. They lived in one of the poorest council estates on the outskirts of town. Eleanor's notes in the margins of the documents were heartbreaking. "Valerie needs new shoes. Hers are worn out. I'll buy them for her myself. She has pure talent, but there is not enough food at home. The food subsidy needs to be increased." Julian read each word as if it were a penance. He understood then the dance from the night before. It wasn't a silly dance. Those arm movements, those turns were fragments of the Nutcracker, simplified to make babies laugh, but executed with the technique of someone who had spent thousands of hours in front of a mirror. At 7 a.m., he heard movement in the kitchen. He got up. His joints creaked. He felt 10 years older than the night before. He went downstairs. He wasn't going to fire her. That was impossible now, but he couldn't tell her he knew everything either. He was afraid that if she found out he knew who she was, she would feel exposed or humiliated and leave. He had to be subtle. He had to change the rules of the game without revealing his hand. He went into the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and toast filled the air, a smell of home that had been absent for so long. Valerie stood with her back to him, preparing the bottles. She was wearing her uniform, immaculate once again, her hair pulled back tightly. When she heard Julian enter, she visibly tensed. Her shoulders rose toward her ears. She expected to be fired, expected to hear the shouting. She turned slowly, her head bowed. "Good morning, Mr. Cavendish," she said softly. "The children's breakfast is almost ready. I've already packed my suitcase just in case. Well, because of what your mother said yesterday." Julian stopped by the marble island. He looked at her, really looked at her. He no longer saw the blue uniform. He saw the girl in the photo. He saw the broken promise. He saw the hands red from detergent and hard work. Hands that should be expressing art, not scrubbing floors. He felt a lump form in his throat, which he had to swallow hard. "No one's leaving, Valerie," he said. His voice sounded strange, hoarse, lacking its usual metallic coldness. Valerie looked up in surprise. Her honey-colored eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me, but your mother said—" "My mother doesn't live here," Julian interrupted. And for the first time in his life, he felt that this statement empowered him instead of frightening him. "This is my home and my children." My children hadn't smiled in 2 years until you came along. He took a few steps toward her. Valerie instinctively stepped back, bumping into the counter. Julian stopped, respecting her space, but his posture shifted. He was no longer the arrogant boss looking down on her. His shoulders slumped. His gaze was almost pleading. Valerie hesitated. Julian hesitated. He wanted to ask her about Eleanor. He wanted to shout at her, "Forgive me," but he held back. "What you did the other night, the dancing." She blushed violently, glancing down at her worn shoes. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." "No," Julian said firmly, but gently. "I want it to happen. I want you to dance." Valerie jerked her head up, confused. "What? That dancing?" Julian searched for the right words, fighting back his emotion. "My wife, Eleanor, she loved ballet. She used to move like that around the house when she was happy. When I saw you, for a moment, I thought light had returned to this house." Valerie's face changed. The fear vanished, replaced by a raw emotion. Her eyes filled with tears. She knew he was talking about Eleanor. She knew he was her mentor's husband. She had always known. That's why she had applied for the womb, to repay Eleanor for a little of what she had given her, even if it meant caring for her children from the shadow of a servant. "Mrs. Eleanor," Valerie whispered, the name hanging in the air between them like a fragile bridge. She said dance was the language of the soul when words fail. Julian nodded, unable to speak. "My children need that language," he finally managed to say. "They need someone who can speak to them with their soul, because I've forgotten how. I only know how to speak with money and silence, and that's killing them." There was a long silence, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was a silence of recognition. The wall between the millionaire and the nanny had cracked. Julian no longer saw her as a problem to be solved, but as the only possible solution. His motivation had changed radically. It was no longer about having someone watch over the children. Now he had a moral obligation. His mission was to protect that girl, to make up for the harm he had unknowingly caused her. "Stay, Valerie," Julian said, and it sounded almost like a plea. Not like just another employee who fears for her job every time she breathes. "Stay and help them. Help me understand them. Do what you have to do. Dance, sing, build forts with expensive cushions. I don't care, just don't leave." Valerie studied him for a moment. She saw the pain in the man's eyes, the same pain she had seen in Eleanor's eyes when she spoke of her workaholic husband. She nodded slowly. "I'll stay, sir, for Jack and Harry. And why do I need it?" Julian exhaled, feeling an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. He turned to leave, but stopped in the kitchen doorway. Without looking at her, he added, "And Valerie, throw away those yellow gloves. We'll buy some new ones and maybe, just maybe, some ballet slippers. The drawing room's wooden floor is perfect for twirling." He left before she could answer, before she could see his iron mask crack. Valerie stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, her heart pounding, a small, but hopeful smile blossoming on her lips. The monster wasn't so much of a monster after all. He was just wounded. The next 2 weeks at Cavendish Manor were a slow and strange metamorphosis, like watching an ancient glacier melt. Julian was no longer a shadow drifting in and out of the darkness. Now his presence was physical, almost palpable, though still clumsy. He started arriving home at 5 p.m., a time that scandalized his secretary and unnerved his business partners. Mr. Cavendish leaving before the stock exchange closed? Impossible. But it was possible. That Tuesday afternoon, Julian arrived with his tie already loosened from the car. He carried something in his jacket pocket, something small that burned against his chest. It wasn't jewelry or checks. It was 2 pairs of non-slip socks with frog designs for the twins, and hidden at the bottom was a USB drive with music. Upon entering, there was no silence. Classical music, a Tchaikovsky waltz, filled the marble foyer, bouncing off the high walls and making the house, which had always seemed like a museum, finally feel like a lived-in home. He followed the sound into the main drawing room. The designer sofas had been pushed against the walls, leaving a large open space above the polished parquet floor. The golden light of the setting sun streamed through the windows, bathing the scene in a nostalgic amber hue. Valerie stood in the center, barefoot, wearing simple sweatpants and a white t-shirt. Her movements were fluid, precise, with a technical beauty that took Julian's breath away. She twirled with an elegance that contrasted painfully with her reality as a domestic worker. And around her, Jack and Harry tried to imitate her, raising their little arms, falling on their bottoms onto the cushions, laughing uproariously. Julian stood in the doorway, mesmerized. He saw Eleanor and Valerie's every move. He saw the promise he himself had broken by taking away her scholarship. Guilt shot through him, but he pushed it away. Today wasn't about guilt, it was about connection. Valerie sensed his presence and stopped abruptly, lowering her arms. The music continued playing. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, quickly regaining her composure, smoothing down her t-shirt. "You arrived early. Sorry for the mess. I'll move the furniture right now." Julian entered the room. His voice was firm but gentle. "Don't move anything, it's perfect." Jack and Harry, seeing their father, didn't run to hide behind Valerie as they usually did. They stood there in their nappies and t-shirts, looking at him curiously. The atmosphere of fear had dissipated in recent days thanks to Valerie's patience. But there was still an invisible barrier. Julian took off his 1,000-pound jacket and dropped it carelessly onto a Louis XV chair. Then, with slightly trembling fingers, he removed his Italian leather shoes and set them aside. He stood in dark socks on the gleaming wood. Valerie stared at him, wide-eyed, not understanding what was happening. "Valerie," Julian said, feeling ridiculous and vulnerable, stripped of his executive armor. "They follow you. They look at you as if you were magic. I'm a stranger to them. I'm the man who brings toys, but I don't know how to play." He looked at his children who were watching him as if he were an alien who had just landed in their drawing room. "Teach me," Julian pleaded, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "Teach me how to do that, how to dance with them. I want to. I need to enter their world." Valerie blinked, surprised by the humility in the voice of the man who, days before, had threatened her with dismissal. A soft, genuine, and warm smile spread across her face. "It's not difficult, sir. You just have to stop thinking." Valerie went to the music console and restarted the song. The waltz began softly. The problem with adults is that they think too much about how they look. Children don't care if you look ridiculous. They care that you're there making a fool of yourself on them. Julian nodded, swallowing hard. He loosened his tie completely and threw it on the floor. He rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt. "Okay, what do I do?" "Imagine you're a big tree," Valerie said, raising her arms. "A strong oak tree moves its branches in the wind. Don't be rigid. You are cement, Mr. Julian. You have to be flexible wood." Julian raised his arms. He felt stupid. He felt heavy. His muscles, accustomed to the tension of board meetings and the gym, resisted the softness. "Not like that," Valerie laughed. And it was a clean laugh, without mockery. "Look at Jack." Jack, imitating Valerie, waved his arms frantically. Julian looked at his son and for the first time truly smiled. A smile that reached his eyes. "Okay, I'm a tree," Julian muttered. He began to sway. At first it was mechanical, like a rusty robot, but Valerie started spinning around him, and the twins began running between his legs, laughing and shouting, "Daddy Tree! Daddy Tree!" Harry tripped and grabbed Julian's leg to keep from falling. Julian froze for a second at the physical contact, but then instinctively bent down and picked Harry up. The boy didn't cry. He put his sticky little hands on Julian's face and laughed. "Up you go," Harry shouted. "Me too," Jack shouted from below, tugging at his father's trousers. Julian's heart was pounding a mile a minute, a feeling of euphoria that no million-pound deal closing had ever given him. He lifted Jack up with his other arm. He had both his sons in his arms. They were heavy. They smelled of milk and talcum powder. They were real. "Now spin, sir," Valerie encouraged, clapping her hands. "Spin with them." He started spinning slowly at first, then faster. The music grew louder, the room spun, the expensive furniture, the crystal chandeliers. Everything became a blur of colors. Only his children's laughter filled his ears, and Valerie's bright gaze, watching them from the center of the room with an expression of infinite tenderness. At that moment, Julian tripped. His balance failed him. He fell backward onto the thick rug, shielding the children against his chest. The impact was dull but muffled. Julian lay on his back, breathing heavily, with the two children on top of him. There was a second of silence. Julian was afraid of seeing them frightened, But then Jack burst into explosive laughter. Again, again, Dad, he shouted, pounding Julian's chest with excitement. Julian began to laugh, a deep, rusty laugh that came from the very depths of his chest, releasing 2 years of mourning and bitterness. He laughed until his ribs ached, tears welling in his eyes, but not tears of sadness. Valerie approached and knelt beside them. She didn't intrude on the moment, but she was there, a part of it. You did very well for your first class, Mr. Tree, she said gently. Julian looked up at her from the floor, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled. Thank you, Valerie, he whispered. And in that word there was a tacit acknowledgement of everything she was giving back to him. Life. For a moment their eyes met and held contact. There were no social classes, no past, no debts in that second. Just two human beings sharing the joy of seeing happy children. Julian felt a strange impulse, a gratitude so immense that it almost felt like love, but a different kind of love, born of salvation. But the moment was shattered when a distant, deep, and menacing clap of thunder rumbled outside the house, rattling the window panes. Happiness is fragile, and that night, nature decided to remind the Cavendish family of this with relentless brutality. What had started as a waltz at sunset turned into a midnight or horror opera. The storm that had threatened since the afternoon broke with biblical violence over the home counties. The wind howled, battering the manor, bending the ancient trees in the garden as if they were twigs. The rain fell in curtains so thick that the outside world had disappeared. Julian woke up at 2 a.m., not because of the noise of the storm, but because of a terrifying silence. The electricity had gone out. The smart mansion, which relied on complex systems for everything, was dead, dark. And then he heard the crying, but it wasn't the usual tantrum or nightmare cry. It was a weak, plaintive, sick cry. Julian jumped out of bed, turning on his mobile phone's torch with trembling hands. He ran down the hallway. Upon arriving at the nursery, he found Valerie already there, illuminated by an emergency candle. Her face was pale and distraught. They're burning, sir, she said. Her voice was trembling. They have a very high fever. Too high. Julian approached the cots, touched Jack's forehead. It burned. It was like touching a stove. The child was breathing with difficulty, panting, with his eyes half open, but glassy, unfocused. Harry was the same, moaning softly, his skin red and dry. Call the doctor, Julian shouted. Panic gripped him. The memory of Eleanor's death, cold and lifeless on a stretcher, hit him. He couldn't lose them too. Call Dr. Montgomery right now. There's no line, sir, Valerie replied, struggling to stay calm. The landlines weren't working, and there was no mobile signal. The storm must have knocked down the cell towers in the area. Julian looked at his mobile phone, which was searching vainly for a signal. Damn it, he roared, throwing the phone against the sofa. He ran to the window. The storm was a black wall. I'll take the car. I'll take you to the private hospital. It's 20 minutes away. You can't. Valerie grabbed his arm, stopping him. Her strength surprised Julian. I looked out the window 10 minutes ago. The access road is blocked. A tree fell on the front gate, and the valley stream has overflowed. We're cut off, sir. No one gets in, and no one gets out. Julian froze. He felt the ground opening up beneath his feet. He was one of the richest men in the region. He had helicopters, chauffeurs, private doctors on his payroll, and it was all for nothing. His money was worthless against the fever consuming his children. They're going to die, Julian whispered, wide-eyed, backing away towards the wall. They're boiling over. They're going to have a seizure. It's my fault. My God, it's my fault. The panic attack was paralyzing him. He was turning into a scared child, useless in the crisis. Valerie saw that she was losing him. She saw the father break down when his children needed him most. And then the humble girl from the poor estate, the one who had taken care of her brothers when her mother worked, took charge. Julian, she shouted, using his first name for the first time with an authority that cracked like a whip in the room. Look at me. Julian blinked, snapped out of his trance by the scream. They're not going to die, but I need you to stop being the scared millionaire and be the father they need now. Move. What? What do I do? He stammered. I need vinegar. I need clean towels, and I need us to fill the bathtub with warm water. Not cold, warm. Now, Valerie ordered, as she carried Jack in her arms, cradling him against her chest to transfer calm to him. Julian nodded, grateful to have an order to follow. He ran to the main bathroom and turned on the taps. The water came out, thank God, through the tank's gravity system. He looked for the towels, ran to the dark kitchen, bumping his shin against a chair, but felt no pain. He found the apple cider vinegar and went back to the bathroom. Valerie was already there, undressing the children with quick, inefficient movements. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on the Italian marble tiles. "Get in the bathtub with them," Valerie ordered. "What?" "You're cool. Your skin will help lower their temperature, and they need to feel safe." Julian didn't hesitate. He got into the large bathtub wearing his silk pajamas. The water was lukewarm. Valerie handed Jack to him, then Harry. Julian hugged them to his wet chest. The children were shivering. Valerie rolled up her uniform sleeves and soaked the towels in the water and vinegar mixture. She began gently placing them on the little ones' foreheads and underarms. The smell of vinegar filled the luxurious bathroom, a sour, homely scent that contrasted with the branded imported soaps. "Shh, shh, it'll be okay, my loves. It'll be okay," Valerie whispered, stroking Harry's wet hair. But Jack began to cry louder, a cry of anguish from the discomfort. Julian felt his small body tense up. "Valerie, the fever isn't going down." "It's not going down," said Julian, his voice breaking with terror. "They're still burning." "Have faith, sir. The poor man's medicine is slow but sure." Valerie didn't stop working. She changed the cloths, refreshed the water. Her hands never stopped. And then, to calm the electric atmosphere of fear that filled the bathroom, Valerie began to sing. It wasn't just any lullaby. It was a soft, melancholic melody, but full of a strange hope. An old song about a ship sailing through a storm and a star guiding it. "Sleep, my child, the tide is going out. The moon watches over you. The silver embraces you." Julian, holding his children in the water, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He recognized the song. It was the song Eleanor hummed when she was pregnant, a song Eleanor had told him she learned from her own grandmother. Julian looked up, water dripping down his face, mingling with his own silent tears. He looked at Valerie through the flickering candlelight. She was focused on the children, singing with her eyes closed, with absolute devotion. In that moment, Julian understood that Valerie wasn't just saving his children from the fever. She was saving his family's memory. She was the bridge. She possessed the knowledge, the love, and the strength he thought he had lost forever the day of the accident. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, trying to break in. But in that bathroom, an unshakable sanctuary formed. Julian held his children, and Valerie cared for all three of them. Around 5 a.m., Jack sighed deeply, and his body relaxed against Julian's chest. "He's sweating," Valerie whispered, touching his forehead. "The fever broke, sir." Julian touched his son's skin. It was cool, damp, but cool. He did the same with Harry. His temperature was going down too. Julian let his head fall back against the edge of the tub and released a hoarse, brutal sob of pure relief. "Thank you," he moaned. "Thank you, my God." Valerie, exhausted, sat on the bathroom floor, leaning her back against the vanity. She was soaked, her makeup smeared, her hair plastered to her face, and she smelled of vinegar. But in Julian's eyes, who was watching her from the bathtub with their rescued children in his arms, no one had ever seemed as beautiful or as powerful as she did in that moment. "You did it, sir," she murmured with a weary smile. "You were their refuge." "No," Julian replied, staring at her with a newfound intensity. "It was you. You saved us." And in the damp, dark silence of that bathroom, with the storm subsiding outside, Julian knew he could no longer be the distant boss. That night, Valerie had become something more, something essential, something he no longer knew if he could live without. The silence that followed the storm was, paradoxically, the loudest sound Julian had ever heard. It wasn't the empty, echoing silence of his usual solitude. It was a dense, warm, shared silence, woven with the utter exhaustion of two people who had just won a battle against death. In the nursery, the only light came from the candles slowly burning down on the dresser, casting long, dancing shadows on the cloud-painted ceiling. The air still smelled faintly of vinegar and dampness, but now that scent wasn't unpleasant. It smelled of life, smelled of survival. Julian and Valerie had dried the twins with reverential gentleness. They dressed them in soft, dry cotton pajamas and put them back in their cots. Jack and Harry, exhausted from fever and crying, fell into a deep and immediate sleep with the rhythmic and tranquil breathing of angels. Julian stood beside Jack's cot, his hand resting on the wooden railing, watching his son's chest rise and fall. His own silk pajamas were still damp, clinging to his skin, and he felt the cold seeping into his bones, but he didn't care. He couldn't move. He felt that if he looked away, the fever would return. "They're fine, sir," a soft voice whispered behind him. Julian turned slowly. Valerie was sitting on the thick rug, her legs stretched out and her head resting against the side of the nursing chair. She looked like a soldier after the war, her uniform wrinkled, her loose hair falling in disheveled waves over her shoulders, her feet bare and pale. Her eyes were surrounded by dark shadows, but they shone with an eerie peace. Julian let himself fall to the floor, not onto the chair, but onto the rug near her. The distance between employer and employee, that invisible line drawn by money and social class, had been erased by the bathwater. "I was afraid," Julian confessed. His voice was hoarse, fractured, a confession he would never have made to anyone, much less an employee. "I was absolutely terrified. When I touched them and felt that heat, I saw Eleanor, I saw the hospital, I saw the heart monitor flatlining. I felt powerless, all my money, all my buildings, my Swiss bank accounts, and I couldn't buy 1 degree less heat for my children." He ran his hands over his face, rubbing his eyes hard. "I'm a failure, Valerie. I didn't know what to do. I froze if you hadn't been here." Valerie shifted slightly, leaning toward him. The candle light illuminated half her face, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. "You didn't freeze, Julian," she said, omitting "sir" for the second time that night. And it rang as natural as breathing. "You got into that bathtub. You held them. They calmed down because they felt your heartbeat, not mine. A father isn't the one who has all the answers. He's the one who stays when the storm comes. And you stayed." Julian lifted his head and looked at her. In her eyes, he saw a deep understanding, a complete absence of judgment. "You knew what to do," he said admiringly. "That song, where did you learn it?" Valerie lowered her gaze to her hands resting in her lap. She smiled wistfully. "A wonderful woman taught it to me," she whispered. "She told me that songs are maps to find your way home when you're afraid. She saved me many times, just as you saved your children today." Julian felt a lump in his throat. He knew she was talking about Eleanor. He wanted to tell her that he knew, that he had seen the photo, that he knew she was the butterfly his wife spoke of. But the moment was so fragile that he was afraid of breaking it with explanations. "Thank you," he said simply. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." Julian crept a little closer until they were just inches apart. He could see the gold in her eyes. "You've given me back my children. And I think you're giving me back myself. I've been dead for 2 years, Valerie. Walking, signing papers, breathing, but dead inside. Today, when I saw you taking care of them, when you sang, I felt myself waking up." The air between them changed. It crackled with static electricity, a tension that wasn't sexual in a vulgar sense, but profoundly spiritual and human. It was the attraction of two souls recognizing each other in pain and hope. Julian reached out, hesitating for a second, and then with infinite gentleness touched Valerie's cheek. Her skin was cold, but beneath his fingers he felt the warmth of life. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and sighed, tilting her face slightly toward his hand, accepting the touch as a gift. "You're not dead," she whispered, opening her eyes, fixing them on his. They were two oceans of honesty. "You have a lot of love stored up inside, Julian. You're just afraid that if you take it out, it will hurt again. But love doesn't run out, it multiplies." Julian felt a solitary tear roll down his own cheek. Valerie raised her hand, small and rough from work, and with her thumb wiped away that tear. It was such an intimate gesture, so full of tenderness, that the outside world completely disappeared. "Never leave," he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't leave as long as they need me," she promised. Physical and emotional exhaustion finally took its toll. There were no kisses or sudden movements. The weight of their exhaustion simply overcame them. Julian let his head fall back against the armchair, and Valerie rested hers on the seat of the same armchair, very close to him. And so, in the dimness of the nursery, with the smell of vinegar fading and the candles going out one by one, the millionaire and the nanny fell asleep on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, united by an invisible bond that was stronger than any contract. The morning sun burst into the room with brilliant insolence, ignoring the drama of the previous night. The birds were singing outside, oblivious to the fact that hours earlier the world seemed to be ending. Julian woke up first. His neck was stiff and his body felt numb from sleeping on the floor. He blinked, disoriented by the light. The first thing he saw were the cots. Jack and Harry continued sleeping peacefully with rosy cheeks of health, their fever completely gone. Julian let out a sigh of relief so deep that it hurt his chest. Then he looked to his side. Valerie was still asleep, curled up in a ball on the carpet. A lock of hair fell over her face. She looked so innocent, so vulnerable. Julian felt a wave of fierce protection. He remembered the previous night, the intimacy, the promise. He smiled to himself. Everything was going to change from today onwards. He was going to formalize his situation. He was going to confront his mother. He was going to do the right thing. He got up carefully so as not to wake her. He urgently needed a shower. He smelled like dried sweat and vinegar. He wanted to be clean and presentable when she woke up. He wanted to prepare her breakfast himself, serve her coffee as an equal. He left the room in silence, leaving the door ajar to listen to the children, and headed to his master suite. He stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the fear of the night before, unaware that the real hurricane was about to enter through the front door. Downstairs in the lobby, the heavy oak doors opened. Lady Victoria Cavendish entered, her heels clicking loudly, followed by her driver, a large, silent man. The road had been cleared by the emergency services at dawn, and Victoria, moved by a maternal intuition, or rather by her desire for control, had decided to come and inspect the storm damage on her son's property. "Julian," she called, but no one answered. The house was silent. Victoria frowned. She saw mud at the entrance. She saw towels lying in the hallway that Julian had dropped in his haste the night before. "What a disaster! This looks like a pigsty," she muttered in disgust. She went up the stairs, guided by her predatory instinct. As she passed by Julian's room, she heard the shower running. Good, he's taking a bath, she thought. She continued walking toward the nursery, pushed open the door, and what she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. Her eyes narrowed into two venomous slits. There, on the floor of her grandchildren's room, sleeping like a vagrant amidst a nest of rumpled blankets, was that disheveled woman. Her clothes wrinkled. And worst of all, she saw Julian's silk pajama jacket lying on the floor a few feet away. Victoria's twisted mind needed no further proof. For her, the equation was simple and vulgar. The nanny, the night, the strewn clothes, the proximity. "Whore!" Victoria whispered, a hatred that rattled in her teeth. She entered the room with a determined stride. She didn't care about waking the children. She raised her cane and struck Valerie's leg hard. "Get up!" she shouted in a shrill voice that shattered the morning's peace. Valerie woke with a start, disoriented, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Victoria's dark figure looming over her, silhouetted against the window light like a fairy tale witch. "My lady," Valerie stammered, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" "Don't you dare mention my grandchildren with that filthy mouth of yours." Victoria grabbed her arm with surprising strength for her age, digging her dark red painted nails into her skin. "I knew you were a climber. I knew you were a slut, but this is disgusting." "I don't know what you're talking about." Valerie tried to break free, but Victoria shook her. Jack and Harry woke up to the screams and started to cry, frightened by the threatening presence of their grandmother. "Look at you," Victoria spat, pointing at her clothes in the mess, "rolling around on the floor of the children's room with my son. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know what you've been doing? You took advantage of the storm, didn't you? You took advantage of them being isolated to get into his bed, or worse, to drag him down to your level on the floor?" "No," Valerie shouted, tears of indignation welling up in her eyes. "Nothing happened. The children had a fever. We were taking care of them all night. Julian helped me. Don't tarnish his name." Victoria slapped her. The sound was dry and brutal. Valerie's face turned to one side, burning hot. Julian is a gentleman. You are a servant who has drugged my grandchildren or invented an illness to seduce the master. Victoria turned towards the door. Roberto, she called her driver, get this trash out of my house immediately. The chauffeur, an expressionless man, entered the room. Ma'am, please let me explain. Let me wait for Julian. Valerie pleaded, backing away towards the cots, trying to protect the children who were crying inconsolably. Julian is not going to talk to you, Victoria roared. He's in the shower washing off the dirt you left on him, and I'll make sure he knows who you really are. Take her out, Roberto, and throw her rags out into the street. The driver grabbed Valerie by the arm. She tried to resist, looking desperately towards the door, hoping that Julian would appear. Julian, Julian, she shouted, but the noise of the water in the shower, on the other side of the hall and behind closed doors, drowned out her screams. Be quiet. Victoria stepped between her and the door. If you ever come near this house again, if you ever look at my son again, I swear I will destroy you. I have friends in the police, girl. I can have you locked up for theft, for child abuse, for whatever I want. You understand me? Disappear. The driver dragged Valerie out of the room. She tripped and fell to her knees in the hallway, but he pulled her up without hesitation. My children, Valerie sobbed, listening as Jack and Harry's screams turned into panicked shrieks as they saw their protector being taken away. Victoria slammed the bedroom door shut, staying inside with the children, ignoring their crying, satisfied with her cleaning. Valerie was dragged downstairs, across the lobby, where hours earlier she had danced the waltz of happiness. She was pushed out of the front door. She fell onto the wet gravel at the entrance, scraping her hands and knees. The driver threw her bag, which he had picked up from the service entrance, next to her. The lady says not to come back, the man said, and closed the massive mansion door with a dull thud that echoed like a tombstone. Valerie lay there on the ground under the bright sun of a perfect morning, her body aching and her heart in pieces. She looked towards the upstairs window, hoping to see Julian, hoping he would come running to save her like in fairy tales. But the window remained empty. Inside, Julian turned off the shower tap, wrapped himself in a towel, feeling refreshed, ready to start his new life. He hummed the lullaby from the night before while drying his hair, completely unaware that downstairs the love of his life had just been expelled from his world. And his children were alone again with the monster who wore Chanel. Julian left his room, dressing with unusual haste, buttoning up his white shirt as he crossed the hallway. He felt light. For the first time in 2 years, the air in the house didn't feel heavy. He was going to suggest to Valerie that they have breakfast together on the terrace with the children. He was going to break down that ridiculous barrier between employee and employer. He was going to tell her that he knew about the scholarship, about Eleanor, and that he was going to fix everything. But as he approached the door of the nursery, that lightness evaporated. The sound that came from there was not the peaceful silence he had left behind. It was sonic chaos. Jack and Harry were screaming, but it wasn't the cry of fever. It was the cry of abandonment, sharp, hysterical, accompanied by the sound of things breaking. Julian ran the last few meters and pushed the door. The scene he found chilled him to the bone. The room was upside down. The sheets on the cots were torn off. There were toys scattered on the floor, and in the middle of the mess, sitting in the reading chair with imperial rigidity, was his mother, Lady Victoria, reading an architectural digest magazine, as if the apocalypse around her had nothing to do with her. The twins were on the floor, clinging to the bars of the cot, their faces red and swollen from crying so much, looking towards the door, waiting for someone to come in. When they saw Julian, their crying intensified, and they desperately reached out their little arms towards him. "Daddy! Val! Val!" Jack shouted, trying to pronounce Valerie's name in his baby talk. "Val!" Julian ignored his mother and ran towards his children, and he knelt down and hugged them. They were trembling. "I'm here now. I'm here now." He comforted them by kissing their sweaty heads. "Where is Valerie?" Upon hearing the name, Harry pointed to the door and let out a scream of pure pain. Julian turned slowly toward his mother. Victoria calmly closed the magazine and took off her reading glasses, leaving them on the table. "Stop spoiling them, Julian. Crying expands the lungs." "Where is Valerie?" Julian repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone he'd never used with her. Victoria sighed, pulling up the hem of her dress. She's gone. What do you mean she's gone? She was here 20 minutes ago. She was sleeping on this rug after saving your grandchildren's lives. Victoria let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, please, Julian, don't be naive. That girl didn't save their lives. She made a scene to get into your bed. I found her here, lying on the floor like some tart, with your clothes next to her. I fired her. I did the family a favor before she drained you of every last penny or gave you some council estate disease. Julian stood up slowly. The twins clung to his legs, whimpering. He felt a heat rise in his neck, a volcanic fury that had been contained for 34 years by his mission and good manners. You fired her? He asked incredulously. You threw her out on the street? I told the driver to take her out. And don't look at me like that. You should be thanking me. I've already called the international agency. A French governess is arriving tomorrow, a certified older woman who will know how to instill discipline here and won't be dancing or singing vulgar nonsense. Julian looked at his mother. He really looked at her. He saw the jewelry, the perfect makeup, the coldness in her eyes, and then he looked at his children, broken with grief on the floor, and realized that the true rot of this house wasn't Valerie's poverty, but his mother's cruelty. Out, Julian said. Victoria blinked. Excuse me? I said out, Julian roared. The shout was so powerful it rattled the window panes. The twins fell silent in shock. Out of my house, out of my life, and out of my children's lives. Victoria stood up indignantly, gripping her cane tightly. Don't you dare speak to me like that. I am your mother. I am the matriarch of the Cavendish family. Without me. Without you. Julian took a step toward her, trembling with rage. Perhaps I would have been happy long ago. You turned this house into a mausoleum. You despised Eleanor, and now you tried to destroy the only person who has brought light to this hell. You'll regret this, Julian. If I walk through that door, I'll disinherit you. I'll freeze your trust accounts. I'll sink you on the board of directors. Julian let out a bitter laugh, looking around the luxurious room that had given him nothing but loneliness. Keep the money, he shouted at her. Keep the stocks, the buildings, the damn name, I don't care. They are worth nothing compared to a single smile from my children. And you've never made them smile. He bent down and quickly kissed Jack and Harry. I'm going to bring her back, he promised them. Don't move from here. Dad is going to bring Valerie home. Julian, if you go out that door, Victoria threatened. Julian didn't even turn around. He ran out of the room, went down the stairs, skipping the steps two at a time. He arrived at the entrance. His sports car was parked outside. He looked for his keys in his pocket, but realized he was still in dress trousers and a shirt, without a wallet, without a phone. He didn't care. He got into the car. The keys were in the ignition. The driver had moved it. The engine roared with a ferocity that matched that of its driver. Where did you leave her? He shouted to his mother's driver, who was smoking a cigarette next to the limousine. The driver, frightened by Julian's wild expression, threw the cigarette away. At the bus stop on the main road, sir, 2 kilometers away. She said she didn't have any more money. Julian didn't wait. He floored the accelerator, making the tires squeal on the wet gravel, leaving behind the mansion, his mother, and the whole life of appearances that no longer served him for anything. The bus stop was a miserable structure of dirty metal and glass on the side of the country road. There was nobody there except for a solitary figure sitting on the plastic bench, huddled against the cold wind that blew in after the storm. Valerie had the old suitcase at her feet. She wasn't crying. She had no tears left. She was staring into space with dry red eyes, thinking about how she was going to explain to her sick mother that she had lost her job, thinking about Harry's face when the chauffeur dragged her away. She felt empty, used, discarded like a dirty rag. An engine roar broke the silence of the countryside. A black sports car appeared on the horizon, devouring the asphalt at suicidal speed. Valerie didn't even look up. It was probably some rich person in a hurry to get to the country club. But the car didn't pass by. It braked with a violent screech, skidding slightly before coming to a stop right in front of the bus stop. The driver's door swung open. Valerie raised her head in fright, grabbing the handle of her suitcase. Julian got out of the car. His hair was tousled by the wind, his shirt was unbuttoned and stained with mud at the bottom, and he was breathing as if he had run a marathon. He didn't look like a millionaire, he looked like a desperate man. "Valerie," he shouted, running towards the bus stop. She stood up, taking a step back, bumping into the dirty glass. The fear and shame of the morning's humiliation returned suddenly. "Mr. Cavendish, please, I don't want any trouble," she said in a trembling voice. "I'm leaving now. The bus is about to arrive. I didn't steal anything from him, I swear. Your mother can check my suitcase." Julian stopped in front of her, invading her space, but not with a threat, but with urgency. Hearing her defend herself against a robbery she hadn't committed, he felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. "No, don't say that," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "I know you didn't steal anything. I know who you are." Valerie remained still. "What?" "I know who you are, Valerie," Julian repeated, lowering his voice and taking another step closer. "I saw the photo with Eleanor. I know you were the dancer. I know I was the idiot who canceled your scholarship. I know you're in my house because you loved her, not for my money." Valerie paled. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "I didn't want to lie to you. I just wanted to protect what she loved." "I know." Julian extended his hands and with infinite gentleness took Valerie's cold hands in his own. "And you did it. You've done much more than that. You have saved my children, and you have saved me." "Your mother said—" "My mother no longer has a voice in my life," Julian interrupted firmly. "I've kicked her out, Valerie. I've kicked her out of the house. That house is mine and my children's, and I want it to be yours too." Valerie looked into his eyes, searching for some trace of mockery or fleeting pity, but she saw only a naked, burning truth. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I can't go back to that house if you don't come with me." Julian squeezed her hands. "I don't want a nanny. I don't want a French governess. I want the woman who dances at 3 a.m. to scare away monsters. I want the woman who sings in the bathtub when there's a fever. I want you." "Julian, I'm an employee. I'm poor. I'm a man who was lost until you turned on the light." Julian released one of her hands to stroke her face, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Come back with me. For me, not as an employee. Come back as part of the family. Come back so we can dance together. Please." Valerie looked at the bus that was appearing in the distance, slowly approaching along the road. It was her way out, her return to the safety of the familiar, to dignified poverty. Then she looked at Julian, that broken and rebuilt man, who looked at her as if she were the only thing of value in the universe. She thought of Jack and Harry. She thought of Eleanor and the silent promise she had made to her. Valerie smiled, and it was as if the sun came out after the storm. "The floor of your drawing room is great for spinning," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Julian let out a laugh of relief, a euphoric laugh, and he hugged her. He lifted her off the floor, spinning with her right there on the dirty pavement beside the road, while the bus driver drove past honking, thinking they were a couple of crazy lovers. And they were. Epilogue. A year later, Cavendish Manor no longer resembled a museum. There were tricycles parked in the foyer and colorful drawings taped to the once pristine marble walls. There was no silence. There was never any silence. It was 8 p.m. In the main hall, the expensive furniture had been permanently pushed into the corners to create a dance floor. Julian sat on the floor, but he wasn't wearing a suit. He wore worn jeans and a black t-shirt. He held Harry on his lap, while Jack ran around trying to catch soap bubbles floating in the air. In the center of the room, Valerie danced, but this time she wasn't wearing a nanny uniform or yellow gloves. She wore a simple lavender chiffon dress that moved with her like a second skin. Her movements were perfect, graceful, professional. She had recovered her technique, but now she danced with a freedom that the Royal Ballet School would never have given her. The music ended with a soft piano note. Valerie took a final bow to her audience, her husband, and her children. Julian applauded, setting Harry down on the floor, and stood up. He went over to her. Valerie was radiant, a little breathless, happy. "Bravo," Julian whispered, putting his arm around her waist. He took her in his arms and pulled her toward him. "I think the critics liked it," she joked, pointing to the twins who were now rolling around on the rug, laughing. "The lead critic loved it. Julian said, gazing at her adoringly. You know, my mother called today. She wanted to come and see the children for Christmas. Valerie tensed slightly. And what did you say to her? I told her that only people who know how to dance in the rain are allowed in this house, and that she never wanted to get her shoes wet. Valerie smiled and put her hands on his neck. You're bad, Julian Cavendish. I am happy, Valerie Cavendish. Thanks to you. They kissed, a slow and deep kiss. Meanwhile, the playlist skipped to the next song in the background. It wasn't classical music, it was that old lullaby about the ship and the star, but in a cheerful jazz version. Julian took Valerie's hand. May I have this dance, madam? Always, sir, even if you step on my feet. And there, in the center of their imperfect and noisy home, the millionaire and the former nanny began to dance, twirling together, forever closing the scar of the past with the rhythm of true love.